Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CISE Hariri Distinguished Seminar. And this is the last one of this year. And Dr. Andrew Chien is with us today. He is the William Eckhardt Distinguished Service Professor of Computer Science at the University of Chicago, and also a senior scientist at Argonne National Laboratory. Andrew has led the Zero Carbon Cloud Project since 2015. And he's well known for his research in data centers, renewable energy, sustainability, cloud resource management, and software, and graph computing architectures. He's also the leader of the IARPA-funded UpDown System Project, looking into scalable graph analytics systems. Andrew Chien has received numerous awards. He currently serves on the NSF CISE Advisory Committee and NSF Advisory Committee on Advanced Cyberinfrastructure and others. He's a fellow of the ACM, fellow of the IEEE and AAAS. I actually have the pleasure to know Andrew from way back when I was a PhD student at UC San Diego, where he was a professor at the time. Following his professorship at UC San Diego, he was vice president of research at Intel Corporation between 2005 and 2010. He has been since then at University of Chicago. He received his BS, MS, and PhD degrees from MIT, so he's no stranger to the Boston area. Thanks so much for coming here today and visiting us. We had a lot of interesting meetings and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Am I coming through okay? Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful facility you have here. AI is on everyone's mind, so I made this talk, which is focusing on research that we've been doing for some years, right, about data center grid interaction, but now it's all focused through this lens of AI is now transforming everything. And we know that AI is transforming everything because the few financial shows that I watch had started talking about AI about 1.5 years ago, but now they're talking about power grids, which is completely crazy. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cloud and AI power demands, the fact that the grid has plentiful power, but it's not reliable, and some of the effects of that on power availability. And then I'll talk about this idea of data center flexibility, which I know some of you think about and work on, and talk about how it can be possible for that to help the grid decarbonize, right? So not just good for cloud computing, but maybe also good for society and climate change. Then I'll talk about some open problems and some related work, and hopefully we can have some discussion. I should shoot for like 50 minutes. What's the rate? Okay. So first, cloud and AI power demands. Anyone who's been reading the papers knows that this is a hot topic. There's one misperception. I just want to make sure that it's clearly set in everyone's head. People are running around talking about, oh, the power grid's going to be decarbonized real soon now, so we don't need to worry about it. This is manifestly false, at least for the United States, is manifestly false. And this is data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is the canonical source, right, for energy data in the United States. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that renewables in the U.S. are about 21% as of 2021, and increasing about 1% per year. So if this goes really well, and we can increase renewables at that rate, you know, a linear projection would be we might decarbonize the grid in 60 years, 2080, okay? And it's really not that easy, right? Because first, nuclear is decreasing, right? So we'd have to do better than that. And furthermore, each successive 1% is harder, right? Because as you'll see, the fluctuation is the big problem with renewable energy. So first, you know, we're not going to decarbonize the grid anytime soon, so we have to live with a fluctuating, partially renewable grid. The second thing worth observing is that for a long time already, the cloud has had exponential growth in power consumption. What is the cloud? The cloud is hyperscalers like Google and Amazon and Microsoft. There's a very well-known study that was published by a number of distinguished data scientists in Science in 2020 that, being data science, they were reporting on data from 2015 to 2018, several years earlier, so now this is somewhat ancient. But in that data, buried down in the headline which said data center power is not increasing, was this little blue curve for hyperscale power. So the hyperscalers' power was growing, right, exponentially, as could be seen from data in there, and also their own renewable purchase announcements where they talked about how much power that they were buying. That was the trend, and it would have grown like this, right, continued. But of course, we all know something, a little thing called ChatGPT happened in 2022, and the power growth is now something more like this. So think of, we had an exponential, and now we have an AI exponential adding on top of that cloud exponential, and this extremely rapid growth in power consumption. So cloud growth was already massive, and you can think of the AI as accelerating the required power demand by at least 5 years, right? So what was needed, thought to be needed in 2028 is now needed in 2023. Sorry, we're in 2024, so, correct for that. And the data center load is now being projected to double by the EIA in 4 years, doubling in 4 years for data center load from 2022 to 2026. So you're all computer scientists, so you can figure out what the compound annual growth rate for doubling in 4 years is. It's pretty large. And 1/3 of that growth is attributed to generative AI, right? So very, very large part of the problem. Oh, sorry, 1/3 of all power grid growth, not 1/3 of that data center growth. 1/3 of all power grid growth is attributed to generative AI. Okay, so now if you read the papers, you read that in the New York Times, an article was written saying, oh, there's this new surge in power, and it's threatening US climate goals, right? The most interesting part of this picture is that electricity demand in the United States was flat for about 15 years. I know, was flat for about 15 years. And now it suddenly has started to take off, right? So that's why the grid people are not idiots, right? They were in this mode of no growth for 15 years. So what do all their plans say? Flat for the next 15 years, right? And now all of a sudden, right, the cloud companies, the AI companies show up and said, okay, I need gigawatts now, right? So this is a big disruptive change. So one way to think about it is these organizations have 5 to 10 year planning horizons for infrastructure, and they are experiencing a 5 times increase in the growth rate, right? All of a sudden, okay? So what's happening, the result of this is the power grid companies have responded by slowing the retirement of their fossil fuel plants, because all of a sudden they have to support more power capacity. The impact of whatever renewable growth was planned is, of course, less by percentage because the baseline is now increasing for total power, right, if I have a fixed renewable plan. And then what's more difficult about this is many of the other customers in the grids are quite unhappy about this because you, right, meaning the other customers, are being asked to pay for the infrastructure costs associated with this build-out, right? So if we look at, so often, computing likes to think of itself as being a clean and not responsible for all of the travails of society kind of situation, but it's not true in this case. Data centers are a key part of the problem. So here's just a few headlines, if you haven't already, taken this point home. This article on the right talks about how AI is making even sites that were thought to be green less green because of the increased load that's required. In Northern Virginia, which is the world's largest data center market, a lot of the locals are now up in arms saying, we don't want to pay for the infrastructure costs for these cloud companies to come and have their gigawatt data centers in our neighborhood, right? Because who bankrolls, right, the infrastructure build out? The answer is the other ratepayers, right? So that's why they're upset about it, and they should be upset about it, right? And then so on and so forth. I thought it was particularly funny. I got this article just the other day. So this article was published on April 29th. And this, to give you a sense of how far this problem has gotten, this was part of an update news article being sent to a network of CFOs. So this is beyond CTO's level. This is beyond technology companies. This is all CFOs are being told, because you have to care about sustainability, now your sustainability plans are at risk. So data centers are causing a problem. They're a key part of this problem is the main point of this. So how does this play out? So we wrote this paper that is available on archive and will soon be published in e-Energy this summer that sort of explains why it is that renewables and these grids are challenged to support these data centers. So what's shown on this red line is the cloud and AI projection that I was talking about earlier. And this is for the world's largest data center market. This is for Dominion Energy. And we're about here in 2024. So you can see that this green line, which is what they had planned for their reliable data center capacity, has now been passed by this red line, which is the demand. So that means companies are asking for capacity and being told, we cannot connect you at that capacity today, because doing so would endanger the reliability of the grid. Okay? These other lines are interesting, and they basically reflect being able to get power most of the time, but being unreliable some part of the time. So if you're willing to be slightly unreliable, there's more capacity. But that's not how they admit people onto the grid today. People don't ask for unreliable power or accept unreliable power. They say, I want reliable power, And this means, this explains why cloud companies, for example, are upset about being unable to connect to the grid. Now, there's another misperception, which is important to understand, is the data center community for a long time has thought of itself as, I'm not responsible for the grid because I'm just a small part of the load. I'm just 0.1%, I'm 0.5%. Well, that's not true anymore. So in these high density data center regions, the data centers have become a very, very large part of the load. And the numbers here are, in Dominion, would you believe that the data centers are 24% of the grid load? And they're growing at this exponential rate, right? 30, 40% per year, right? And in Ireland, right, this other numbers for Ireland is another hotbed for data centers. It's about 16% of the load and growing, right? So when you're in that kind of environment and you're growing exponentially, you cannot be ignored. You have to be responsible for what's going on the grid. In other grids, it's not really that high, but you might expect that, you know, by the end of the decade, in many of these power grids, it will be 5 or even 10% as a fraction if current projections hold. So the idea here is the data centers are actually challenging this reliability and capacity for the grid. And now you hear people are worried about, can AI get enough power to realize its ambitions? That's the challenge. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is actually the grid has plenty of power, but it's not reliable. So what is that, right? People think of the grid as this simplistic thing. It either has enough power or it doesn't, and I just connect to it and then it's reliable. The National Academy of Engineering declared the grid one of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century. Some of you may be aware of that. And so this, you know, generally pervasive supply of reliable energy to all places, right, is a major engineering accomplishment and not that easy to replicate. But what we did on top of that is, in the last 20 years, is we disrupted that whole model. So we disrupted that model and created privatized markets, right, in these different regions. Each of these is a privatized market. And we did it in order to enable renewable energy to come into the grid, right? So this decentralization and market-based dispatch was designed to allow renewable generators to come to the grid because it turned out the previous folks had not wanted or particularly supported renewable energy coming into the grid. And now these grid renewable generators have gotten very large. Here's a solar farm in Spain that's over 1 gigawatt. And in Gansu, in China, there's a wind farm that's supposed to scale to 8 gigawatts. It's amazing. I don't think it's quite 8 gigawatts yet, but it's supposed to scale to that. So you should think of the power grid as a bunch of these decentralized generators under autonomous control being coordinated by the market. That's actually how this works. So there's this phenomena that we came upon about 10 years ago called stranded power that is now a common occurrence in the grid. So what is stranded power? Stranded power, to understand stranded power, you have to understand a little bit about how the grid works. So the way that the power grid works is that these generators provide offers of power with pricing as well, bids, right, into the market. And there's an entity called an ISO, usually, that runs the market for the power grid. Based on the situation, like how much load there is or where you're generating, the ISO will then tell you, I'll take your power, and they tell you the price they'll take it at, or they'll say, no, I won't take your power, and that's called curtailment. That is, you're not allowed to put that power into the grid. And then the third weird case that happens all the time is they'll say, I'll take your power, but you have to pay me to take it. And this is the weird phenomena of negative pricing in power grids, right? So this is an interesting and different kind of economic engagement that most people think about. So to give you a sense of what this looks like, here's a chart for a particular wind site in MISO, which is in the Midwest, and gives you a sense of how power can be curtailed. What's plotted on the x-axis here is the number of megawatts that were bid into the market, and what's plotted on the y-axis is how many megawatts were allowed into the market, onto the grid, for this particular generation station. And this is a bunch of 5-minute intervals from 2015, right, as you can see in the dates below here. And in a perfect world where all the power you offered was accepted by the grid, all the dots would be on that diagonal line, right, with slope 1. All of the dots that are below that line reflect curtailment because I offered more power than I was allowed to put into the grid, right? So this is a common occurrence. And I would point out that the quantities of power here at the left are not small, right? So the scale of this is about a 120 megawatt station, And the scale of curtailment can easily be, well, tens of megawatts down here. But once you get to points that were, let's see, offered at this level, but only allowed a small amount of power into the grid, you're curtailing like 100 megawatts of power. So that's a lot of power in anyone's book, right? And that would power a whole data center in some cases, right? Okay, so that's the microscopic view. What does the aggregate view of this look like across power grids? So this is a plot that we created for MISO's curtailment and negative price power over a period of about 3 years in 2013 to 2016. And this shows how much power was curtailed. The red is the power that was not allowed into the grid, and the blue is the power that was uneconomic, that was put into the grid at negative pricing. But the most interesting thing about this plot is the scale, right? So literally in the MISO grid, there was somewhere between 2 and 8 gigawatts, right, of excess energy, right, being forced into the grid or being curtailed in this 3-year period, right? And when we first did this study, it was actually kind of a shock to the community because there were a few folks that were looking at grid efficiency and overall energy waste in these grids, but there was no one doing temporal structure characterization and dynamic spatial characterization of where this is happening inside of the grid. So these are the first studies that we're aware of that actually looked at the temporal properties of the grid. And the reason that they never looked at it is they considered it to be waste, and we looked at it from the point of view of could we use it to do something productive? So we needed to understand the structure. Okay, it's not just in MISO. Here's an example of a study. I was fortunate to spend a year on sabbatical at the California ISO. So everyone knows California, those guys are doing great. They're doing all kinds of renewable energy. And they are, right? But one of the things I discovered when I was there was that they had this thing called curtailment happening in California, and it was growing at a 40% compound annual growth rate. So you guys know, anything, even if it's small, that's growing at 40% CAGR becomes big pretty quickly, right? So I wrote this study and I said, okay, here's what it's been for the last 5 years, and here's what it would be if nothing happened for the next 5 years. And this was the projection. And then we revisited this study last year, and much to my surprise, it had been 40% CAGR from 2018 to 2023. So nothing changed, right? So we wrote a paper and actually are describing what the projection would look like if it continued at this rate for the next 5 years. And that produces an outcome in which the California power grid is curtailing 18 terawatt hours of power per year, which is equivalent to 2 gigawatt hours of constant generation over the entire year. Or if you look at just the daylight hours, because that's when the curtailment is likely happening, it's 6 gigawatts of curtailment during daylight hours, right? So phenomenal amount of energy. And there's no evidence, I mean, they have a lot of policies, but there's no evidence that they can afford actually to reduce this curtailment, right? So I expect actually that we're looking at this kind of scenario. It's also happening in ERCOT. The Texas power grid is really famous now, so it's happening in ERCOT as well, and so on. So what is really going on here? Why is this such a hard problem? Because in the old days, before we had renewable generation, we didn't have a big problem with curtailment. So the idea is actually very simple once you understand what's going on in the power grid. So at the left here, we have a bunch of requirements in different states and different countries in Europe to adopt renewable energy, right? So you've all heard of these RPS goals, right? Where we have to be 30% renewable, 50% renewable, and the dream of being 100% renewable, right? And Massachusetts is on that list, right? Massachusetts maybe has the most realistic goals, but they're still very aggressive, right? But if you understand renewable energy, you know that the typical renewable energy generator only generates 30% of its nameplate capacity. Sun doesn't shine all the time, wind doesn't blow all the time. So if I have a 1 gigawatt farm, I get on average 1/3 of a gigawatt, or I get 1 gigawatt a third of the time, or something like that, right? So what that means is, in order to supply a certain capacity, I have to build 3 times the average capacity I need in the grid, right? So that produces a lot of fluctuation. And you know, I had the fun of teaching a sustainability and computing class last fall, and this is the plot that sort of tries to drive this point home. So if I have a grid made of only these statistical generators, and I have 2 kinds, solar generation with 24-hour periodicity, and wind generation maybe with a week or 10 days kind of periodicity, right? And I add them together, all those generators produce a total power plot which looks something like this blue line. Looks pretty horrible, right? So first, if I want to guarantee reliable energy, that's the level I can guarantee reliable energy, right? because that's the bottom of the blue curve, right? And all of this is massive variation, and it's curtailment and excess renewable energy. So you say to me, Andrew, well, that's just a dumb design. I'm just going to buy a crap load of energy storage and store all this stuff. And my response to you is, I don't think you can afford that, right? Because it's a huge amount of energy being stored over long periods of time, right? So this is not exactly the problem. It's slightly different, of course. There's varying load and other kinds of things in a power grid, but this is the conceptual fundamental reason why renewable grids have this problem with curtailment and excess energy. Right. So the consequence of this is broad. That's why grids have excess energy, but not excess reliable power. And by the way, this isn't just in the US. It's not that the US doesn't know how to do renewable energy. It's also a big problem in all over Europe. And of course, the one secret we don't talk about very much is China is the world's largest generator of renewable energy. And it's a big problem in China as well, right? Okay. So again, if you're into, sort of a detailed analysis of this, it turns out that the Department of Energy had a blue ribbon panel to look at this question, and they wrote this nice paper in 2017. You can find this paper, and they basically characterized the problem as decreasing capacity factor as renewable penetration increases. Okay, that's a little bit obscure and technical, but the basic idea is, as I add more renewable generation to the grid, the net benefit I get for each unit of renewable capacity decreases, right? And of course, for each renewable capacity I put on the grid, I'm still getting this 30% kind of thing. And the gap between the negative slope of these things and the 30% average I would expect is being lost in curtailment or negative price power or what have you. So we have a blue ribbon panel at the Department of Energy whose results basically validate this idea that stranded power is a reality and will continue to grow, right? Okay, so what AI problem? Why do we have an AI problem? The data center, the grids have lots of power. Well, actually the problem is the grids have lots of power, but it's not reliable. And what do the data centers demand? Anyone ever talk to a data center person? I want reliable power. I want 5 nines, 6 nines or something, right? That's the demand, right? And I want my power when I want it, not when you tell me I can have it, right? So the problem is, right, this mismatch between this availability of this power that's extremely unreliable or slightly unreliable and this demand of extremely high reliability for these data centers, right? So we've been working on the idea that data center flexibility can help the grid decarbonize, right? What does that mean? Turns out large adaptive loads are the key solution to this problem. Large adaptive loads of all types, not just data centers, but data centers are a particularly important opportunity. And probably I would say that they have a larger responsibility because they're the ones driving the growth of the power grid. Oh, and by the way, they're very wealthy companies, right? So the idea here is that the power grid needs help or it can't decarbonize. The reason is that these growing loads actually, so it's data centers, it's the manufacturing and reshoring initiative that the Biden administration has been triggering, it's electric cars, it's all kinds of things that increase electrical load that are making it harder and harder for the grid to decarbonize because they're driving load up. And I think that there's sort of a moral responsibility for these data centers to help balance the load because it turns out they have like 100 times higher profits than the power grid. So if you thought the power grid was a lucrative business, I think you're wrong. If you were thinking they could just pay for all this infrastructure, I think you'd find that they're fairly threadbare, right? So just to give you some sense of this, the power grid that runs the whole Midwestern region of the country has annual revenue of about $320 million. That's just a drop in the bucket, right, for what some of these large data center infrastructures are spending. I think Google just announced, or Microsoft just announced its 2024 capital plan. It was $50 billion, right? That's the capital plan, not the TCO for their data center complex. Okay, so there's a big disconnect in sort of that. Now, the second thing that shows that we're already in trouble here is that California, which has pushed very hard on these decarbonization, and it's up to almost, say, 40, so maybe 45% renewable energy these days. A bad thing happened, which is the price of power in California has nearly doubled over those last 5 years. So the carrying cost of all of this change towards renewable generation is driving up the retail cost of electricity, so it's not coming for free. So if we don't help the power grid, none of us wants to pay 4 and 5 times the price we're currently paying for electricity. We need these adaptive loads, and data centers are one of the ways that they can be provided. I should check. How am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing good. Pretty good. Okay, so why is this hard? This should be an easy thing, right? We got all these smart people, we got super powerful computing and so on. Well, it turns out data center grid coordination is difficult because when you think about one data center, you want power and you want low carbon, low price power. You want it to be stable or reliable. And then you want to optimize for you, right? So this is the traditional way to think about it. So the data center tries to be efficient, it tries to be cost effective and all those kinds of things. And then I've got another data center over here, and it wants the same kinds of things, but it wants it for itself, right? Because these data centers are owned by different entities, and they're all optimizing for themselves. And then what's going on is the power grid is running a global optimization over the entire system that's subject to all the generation, all the different load, and because it's a public serving entity, it's required to do this global optimization and then treat all the customers fairly, right? Okay. So it does what's called global dispatch. It optimizes for dispatch cost, and it optimizes for grid reliability, right? So the problem is these goals turn out to be conflicting and divergent, and those optimization criteria are competing. So the grid folks have a certain set of goals, the data center folks have a certain set of goals, and they're not compatible. And the way we resolve those goals in most parts of the United States is through markets, right? And so that's how these systems are all coupled together. They're coupled through these complex markets. And because power is a perishable resource, right? The markets are much more complex than most markets you're used to thinking about. So they have a day-ahead market and an hour-ahead market and their real-time market, and they do a convergent, they try to converge the generation and the supply through that successive iteration market. So that market supports third-party financial players, it supports collusion, it supports large loads and dynamism. So if you're going to actually study this problem, it's super important that you study this as a holistic system, not as just a piece of the system, right? So you can mess around and do data center optimization and get some benefit, but it's unclear what that means for the overall grid when you connect it to a large system, right? Okay. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about how you could couple these things. So the first thing to have as a baseline in your head is as I add data centers to the grid, like you heard about happening, they decrease the grid RPS. Okay, so they're intrinsically negative towards decarbonization. And here's a plot that shows some simulations that we did of a grid with higher and higher levels of wind penetration across the x-axis here. And you can see that these lines, the top line corresponds to having no data centers in the grid, and the bottom line corresponds to having 40 data centers in this grid. I think these are 200 megawatt data centers. And what you can see is that the addition of data centers is depressing the achieved renewable portfolio standard or the renewable power absorption of the grid. So why is this? Well, it turns out if your data center is a constant load, and I have this fluctuating supply of renewable energy, then I can absorb more renewable energy when it's available by this data center being on, but all the rest of the time when the renewable energy is not available, right? Now I'm pulling fossil fuel energy or something like that into the grid, right? And therefore I'm driving the RPS down, right? So it turns out what used to be true, constant loads were good loads for the grid, is no longer true. Constant loads are not good loads for the grid. You actually want a load that co-varies with the availability of renewables, right? You want to use energy when the sun's shining, when the wind's blowing, whatever, metaphor you want to use. So here's why constant data center loads are actually regressive for the power grid. So let's talk about two different ideas for how to do it. I'm going to talk briefly about zero carbon cloud, and then I'll talk about some more recent work on cooperation with the grid. But the zero carbon cloud idea is good to get you guys to understand this. And I know many of you are computer scientists, so this will make perfect sense to you. So we started with an idea back in 2015 of, well, I've got this power grid, and it supplies reliable power, as shown here. And the normal way to connect data centers is to put them on the reliable side of the power grid and run them reliably, right? So the idea of zero carbon cloud was, well, okay, let's start with that, but then let's add some data centers on the unreliable side of the power grid, right? So they're not conceptually required to be on all the time. And we're going to run those data centers only when there's excess renewable energy, right? Hence the idea of zero carbon cloud, right? Zero operational carbon, right, for these data centers, right? It turns out that that power, of course, can not only be low carbon, it can actually be zero marginal cost. So all of our models only took power when the net price for that power was zero cost. Well, why is power zero cost? Well, I told you power could be negative priced. So the idea is you run as long as you can while it's negative, and then you accumulated all that credit, right? And then you keep running for a while when it's positive, right? The power price is positive until you zero out your cost, right? So this is a game to aggregate regions of time when power is available at net zero cost, right? Not net zero carbon, net zero cost. You probably haven't heard that term very much, for the data center. And it turns out if you do this, it helps the grid absorb more renewables. So since I'm talking to a room full of computer scientists, it's easy to explain why this doesn't mess up the power grid. The idea is that this protocol is much like TCP. It's a differential protocol, right? So we only run when we sense that there's this excess renewable energy, right? Therefore, we're not competing for any power that anyone else would ever want to use or pay for, right? So this is why TCP IP works, right? Where I sense congestion and I back off, right? This is that kind of differential load, same kind of idea, right? And this project actually got some visibility and some success. You know, as crazy academics, right? We started writing papers about this in 2015. Some bright financial market, capitalists, venture capital types, entrepreneur types showed up at my office in Chicago in 2018 and they said, yes, we want to do this. We raised $100 million. This company called Lancium went off and built a bunch of these facilities, and Riot Blockchain and some others are doing this in Texas. And this is a picture of one of their facilities in 2021. So they really took off and they did this, much to my chagrin, they did it for Bitcoin, right? But that's not surprising. That's a perfectly, you know, suitable application. I'm not going to weigh in on whether it's good or bad, but a suitable application for this kind of intermittent power, right? And as you guys probably know, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas has been on the Senate floor talking about how Bitcoin is going to save the Texas power grid. And so how does it actually save the power grid? It's not a completely crazy idea. I'm not going to defend it as a rigorously sound idea, but the idea is basically these folks run and pay a small amount of money to the power grid when there is power generated that formerly would have been excess and gone to waste. So they're subsidizing the infrastructure, right, for all those generators, often renewable generators, right? And then they go away whenever there's a crisis, right? Zero carbon cloud style, and that arguably could be economic support for the grid. Now, anyway, I just think it's funny because as a professor, you never expect that someone will be talking on the floor of the Senate about work that you did, right? So it's kind of fun, right, that this happened, but I'm not defending Ted Cruz's opinion on this technology. Okay. So how does this actually work? Well, we did a bunch of studies of power grids, and this shows very well in terms of a power grid person would appreciate. So there's a global metric that they use for power dispatch called dispatch cost, which is some integrated view of the cost of all the power that you use to satisfy the demand. There's a bunch of scenarios here with different ways of coupling these data centers to the grid. As you might guess, the black line here is the zero carbon cloud model for coupling. And compared to these three different scenarios, we were able to show that you could decrease the dispatch cost, that is the global metric for goodness, right, for the grid operation, by 44% by adding 20 200 megawatt data centers to this grid, right? So this is a much preferred way of coupling load to the grid versus reliable power. Another way of looking at it is you could figure out how it affected the renewable absorption, that is the total grid power that was renewable energy. And here the gap is, you know, as much as 7 points, right? 7%, 18 terawatt hours of increased renewable absorption, right? So same story on the other side. We also did some work to show actually you can build these data centers as cost effective, and that's basically a trade-off between the effective duty factor you can get, what fraction of time these data centers are on, plus the capital costs and all of those kinds of things. And the basic idea here is what's surprising to people is that if you go and live in the right place in the grid and attach yourself to the right place, you can get remarkably high duty factors for the grid. Here's two places where we had 60% and 79% availability, but people have done studies to show there's places where you can get 90% or 95% power availability, and that makes this all pay off, right? So you get cheap power, you get no negative impact on the grid for decarbonization, and so on. And of course, you guys all understand the cloud. So when I said reliable data center, unreliable data center, you knew I was just talking about virtualization, right? So we don't have to say it's a whole data center. We can have a data center and it can have a certain capacity that's operated with reliable power and a certain capacity that's operated only when there's stranded power available, right? So I can build this virtualized view of this, and Google could operate their data centers this way, or Amazon could operate their data centers this way if they were willing to support this kind of variability, right? So it's purely conceptual that they're separate data centers and they exist at different points in the grid, right? There's really no difference between that and this virtualized view. Make sense? Okay, great. Okay, so that's the challenge for these adaptive loads. And this zero carbon cloud idea, this protocol, actually got taken up as a new market product inside the ERCOT power grid and in several other power grids. So if you're interested in how this happened, there's something called LFLTF, terrible acronym, Large Flexible Load Task Force, okay? And basically they designed a product which does exactly what zero carbon cloud does, which is you can buy power on the with the caveat that if we tell you to go away, you go away, right? Which is what zero carbon cloud does. So that's the way of coupling it in the market mechanisms, okay? Okay, so that was great. Now, the interesting thing is, once you start to think about having these 100 megawatt, even gigawatt loads going on and off the grid in these ways, you start to get worried, right? Because historically, grid loads have not been rapidly changing and dynamic. And you can cause all kinds of problems if you start to have very, very large swings of power in very short periods of time. So some large computing loads are already causing problems. You probably heard stories that supercomputers that go from running idle loop to running high performance LINPACK, right, might go from almost zero power up to tens of megawatts of power in a few seconds, right, maybe less. 25, 50 megawatt data centers, supercomputers have already been causing problems with the power grid, right? So they actually have to pre-plan for this, and they spool up extra generation, and they do all this stuff to avoid voltage sagging and so on. So the big challenge is, if I'm gonna do these at large adaptive loads, how do I avoid destabilizing the grid? How do I avoid wild pricing changes? That might be almost as bad, destabilizing the financial part of the grid. And how do I avoid, more importantly, triggering lots of fossil fuel generation, right? Because when I hit the grid with 50 megawatts of load, what do you think happens? Well, the wind doesn't start blowing harder all of a sudden. What happens is I turn on a bunch of other generation, probably fossil fuels, right? So this is the problem. So how do I behave well so as to not cause all the outcomes that I didn't want to have happen? So we've been studying this now for about the last 4 years. And we've been studying ideas that have different adaptation scopes and approaches. So this picture on the left is intended to depict this idea of selfish data center optimization. And there's been a lot of work done on this. It's not necessarily selfish, but it usually is formulated that way. But the idea is you think about yourself and you think about optimizing for that scope, right? And then you change your behavior looking at grid metrics and things like that, like power price and so on. I'm gonna talk also about this scheme we came up with called Plan Share, which is a cooperative approach. And that cooperative approach involves the data center making a plan, sharing it with the grid a day in advance, and then conforming with that plan the next day. Surprisingly, just sharing this information turns out to make a really large positive difference. So these things vary in the scope of coordination and the timing of information sharing and so on, right? Okay, so the first study we did was just this selfish optimization. And sorry, not quite. The green bars are the selfish optimization. So this is a dynamic programming scheme doing online adaptation based on the LMP, the price of the power. Turns out the LMP, the price, is a better predictor than the average carbon intensity. That's a whole interesting, different discussion why price is a better predictor. But if you're a data scientist, you know that what you want is the thing that's the best predictor or the highest correlation, not necessarily the literal signal that you want to optimize. So what happens here is, if you look at a bunch of different scenarios, as the wind penetration, the amount of renewables in the grid increases, the absolute benefit you can get in terms of better RPS, right, higher renewable absorption, increases as we have more renewable energy in the grid. The green and then the hashed green represent the data centers with a 20% dynamic range and a 40% dynamic range. So basically the hash version, the data center can swing more up and down. So you get slightly higher benefit, right? So that's the data center optimization. The purple bars reflect what happens if you give that freedom to the grid and say, to heck with the data center people, you set that power level to whatever is good for the grid, right, to maximize renewable absorption. And you can see what happens is, actually, if you give the power grid control, it does better, right? It has more information, it's optimizing over a larger scope. It can actually enhance renewable absorption better. There's one other thing that's going on that isn't depicted here. All of these things improve the data center RPS, the average carbon intensity of the power they consume, and power cost for them, for the data centers, but it may harm other customers in the grid. Like all this flapping around by the data centers may cause your power to be more expensive, your power to be more expensive, and so on. So this is a classic example of big players in a market affecting small players adversely. So I'll talk a little bit more about why these two schemes have problems. It turns out this was our first attempt at it. We were trying to understand the problem. It didn't really solve the problem all that well. We were trying to understand what happened when you simulated the data centers and the grids together and looked at generally the schemes others had proposed, right, and how well they worked. Turns out the green bars have a problem. So with this local optimization, the strategy is kind of as follows. So if I have a center point here, I'm going to increase my load. That's the x-axis here. I'm going to increase my load when I think there's excess renewable energy in the grid, right? And then I'm going to decrease my load when there isn't enough or there isn't excess renewable energy. So in a perfect world, when I increase my energy, there would be no increase in fossil fuel generation, right? They'd be on this red line. And then when I decrease, right, I'm going to decrease fossil fuel generation almost linearly, right? So if you do a simulation and you compare these things, it turns out the dots don't fall on those two red lines. So your control policy is not achieving the desired impact on the grid, though it might be good for you locally. And what's happening here is that these data centers are actually all diving for the renewable power at the same time because they're all doing separate optimization. They look at the same signals, they all turn on load at the same time. Lo and behold, there isn't enough power for them. So they all kick on a bunch of fossil fuel generation and nobody gets the outcome that they want, right? So that's what you find. So that doesn't work. So local optimization doesn't work as this problem. You need something more coordinated. The second thing that happens is, so that was for the green bars. Now if we have grid control, that is if we allow the power grid to set these power levels, right? You might say, okay, well, you showed me that the power grid can actually produce significant reductions in the carbon emissions. That's great. But it turns out they do something bad to the data centers. So here we have, again, these 4 levels of wind penetration. And we have we have the capacity change per hour. What is capacity change per hour? That's the percentage that the data center is getting turned up and down in absolute value per hour. So what you can see is something really bad is happening. So as I get to the really beneficial reductions in carbon, you can see that the capacity changes for the data center are up around 30% per hour. I don't know of anyone who wouldn't run screaming from the room if you're a data center operator if you told me I was going to change your capacity 30% every hour. By the way, that's the average. That means sometimes it's more, right? So the problem is if you give the grid control, it completely messes up the data centers. And you know, you can map that into computing productivity however you would like. The idea here is that the effect on the data centers is severe and negative. And if you look at some scheduling algorithms, right, based on this kind of fluctuation, we've seen that you can reduce the effectiveness of that computing capacity that you get by 30 to 50%, 30 to 60%, right? So quite a lot, right? And that's not a big surprise. If I start changing your capacity up and down 30%, you would think you're going to cause a lot of jobs to fail and terminate and so on. So that doesn't work either, right? So the third scheme we came up with, and actually we're very happy that this seems to at least solve a significant part of the problem, is something called plan share, which is this idea of cooperation with the grid. By the way, when you talk to the data center companies about this, they generally say, we don't want to share any information, right? We're very secretive. But this idea is that each data center creates a day-ahead plan of this is the power profile I'd like to have. Gives it to the grid, and then the grid takes all of the information from all of the data centers and builds a dispatch plan, right? And it turns out that this approach allows you to get benefits that are larger than the previous schemes, than the data center control schemes. So the wind penetration increases from left to right here. The blue bar is the plan share scheme. And then the best selfish adaptation scheme is the purple one next to it, right? So the purple one next to it is always lower. Plan share gives you more benefit, right? So it turns out that by giving up this online freedom, right, this online control freedom, and giving a day-ahead plan, we're able to achieve much better results at the grid level, okay? So what happened to capacity variation? Well, we use this plot to understand, how good these schemes are in this two-dimensional direction. So the y-axis here is the data center carbon reduction. So that was the RPS improvement or the reduced carbon. And then the x-axis here is the average capacity change per hour, right? So before we were saying, what these things look like, and you can see how they vary. The grid control scheme was out here. That was the 30%, right? So nobody wants to be out there. The plan share scheme versus these two local adaptation schemes has slightly higher capacity variation, but it achieves a much higher data center carbon reduction, right? And therefore decarbonization of the data center activity. So what's happening here? It turns out that by giving the information to the power grid in advance, it's able to do a much better job of optimizing over the global schedule for the power grid. And that allows it to avoid, right, this unexpected turn on of fossil fuel generation, the kind of contention that we talked about before. And of course, because the expectation of the data centers can be expressed in the plan, right? So they would never propose to be changing 30% every hour. Here they're actually not changing much more than 12 or 14%. Now, of course, this is not perfect. What you really want is something up here in the upper left corner, right? So we still have work to do, but this is dramatically better than having to pick between these two schemes, right? And we think this is, as far as we know, the current state of the art. Okay, so what does this have to do with this picture about data centers and reliability? Well, it turns out if you're willing to accept some kind of partnership, that you may be able to raise the reliable power or the feasible power of these data centers up from this dark green line to this dotted green line, or even up to this dotted pink line, right? Because this cooperation, right, allows you to actually, basically eliminate or cheat your way through, in some sense, these reliability guarantees, because I no longer have to guarantee I'm 100% available all the time, right? So the argument here is that actually means there is sufficient power in the grid for these AI data centers, but they need to accept a slightly different way of operating. Okay, so I always think it's important if you talk about some piece of research to talk about how it's not completely done, right? That's for the students in the audience, but it's also an act of humility, I think, for researchers. I'd just like to talk about a few things. The first is that this idea of stranded power, it's a super important and growing phenomena. I think it's going to force us to fundamentally rethink the way we think about power, and it's why I sometimes tell people who work on energy efficiency that that's not maybe the perfect way to think about efficiency anymore, because we don't worry about there's wasted energy when the sun is falling down on the ground outside, right? Well, a solar panel is kind of like that, right? When sun falls on the solar panel, it generates electricity. Why do we have to use every bit of electricity that comes out of it? That's sort of the maxim of energy efficiency, right? But actually, maybe we could waste energy if we only use it when the sun's shining or something like that, right? So a slightly different way of thinking. In the context of power markets, in the context of power markets and global markets, this phenomena is super important. There's lots of clever ideas for how to exploit it. Like some people are exploiting it with hydrolyzers to manufacture hydrogen. Some people are talking about using it for fertilizer, for nitrogen fixing, and other kinds of things. So there's lots of interesting ideas for how to use it. But one really interesting data science problem that hasn't been attacked aggressively as far as I know is to globally characterize in all these different grids and all these different markets, what kind of stranded power availability is there? How is it changing over time? How does it change as grids evolve, right? Because this is a fundamental new resource that's available and we don't know how to exploit, right? So that's a big opportunity. A second really interesting area is, I can talk about how to build a scheme where the data centers share information with the power grid and this wonderful thing happens. But at the end of the day, the way that this gets deployed is in market products, right, in these markets that resolve these changes. So there's really interesting questions about how to design the market products and the market mechanisms and information sharing around them that enables this synergistic large load or data center adaptation. And it's applicable to many things beyond data centers, right? And, you know, power grids that are going to achieve, you know, 80, 90% renewable energy are going to have, you know, tens of percent, 30, 40% adaptive load in order to do that at similar costs to what we have today. For computing people, of course, understanding how to shape compute load is always interesting, right? So how much load flexibility is there? We all know AI training potentially is flexible. How do you make those loads synergistic with the grid? So that's a common cause for many of us to work on in computer science. There's another problem, which is how do you build data centers to actually be dynamic, right? So no data center I know of was actually designed to fluctuate from 30% to 100% load, right? Most of them, they have a target operating point, and they designed it for 6 nines, right? And that operating point, actually they don't operate at that operating point. That's one of the fallacies of data centers. But it's a whole different thing to design a data center to be fluctuating all the time. And what does cost optimization mean, and what does reliability optimization mean in a system like that? And you know, Isa and I were talking about embodied carbon or life cycle carbon at lunch. The consequences of the life cycle carbon of additional capacity that I build is an important part of the equation, right? I can't just eliminate the operational carbon and grow, you know, embodied carbon without bound, right? There has to be some reasonable balance between those things. So that's this dynamic data center design problem. Oh, and then of course people care about water and other kinds of things for these data centers. So it's important to be able to optimize, once I have a design, data center operation for energy, water use, carbon emissions, and many other kinds of things. So there's a bunch, those of you who think about control, there's a bunch of optimization, online optimization problems that are quite interesting for quite complex spaces for these data centers. So I'm almost done. So there's a tremendous amount of wonderful work in this area, and I can't possibly talk about all of it. But let me just call out a couple different vectors of it and sort of point out how it is similar or different from what we've been doing. So there's a long history of really terrific work in scheduling and demand response, really for the goal of what people would call peak reduction, right? Because it turns out there's a power market pricing phenomena where you get billed at the end of the year based on what your peak load was during certain periods. So there's been a whole bunch of terrific work that looks on scheduling and how do you deal with this kind of peak reduction, both in classical kinds of power grids, so coupling to power market pricing. And then there was some really nice work that was done by a fellow who's now at Microsoft, Riccardo Bianchini and Inigo Guari, when they were at Rutgers, before they went to Microsoft, looking at what happens if you look at a data center that has renewables next to it, and then is connected to the grid, and then you're also trying to do this peak reduction kind of thing. So really nice work there. A little bit different from what we're doing because they're not coupling to a sort of fully dynamic grid and looking at carbon and power and so on. There's been a bunch of work on what I would call this local optimization view that looks at load shifting. And some of this stuff takes into account some grid information, but most of this work wasn't done in coupling with a full grid simulation and looking at the impact of the dynamic behavior on the grid. So a bunch of really nice work done here. Some of it was done by folks in this room. But a little bit different because it does not have the full grid modeling going on and the dynamics around that. And the argument is that was probably good work for grids that don't have a high percentage of data centers in them. But once you start to have a significant percentage, and you'd be surprised, only a few percent can start to be enough, then you start to be the swing player and sort of change the behavior or dynamics of these grids. There's, I think, super interesting work in this area of stranded power and grid studies on curtailment and waste. We've done a bunch of work in this space. We're hoping to attract others into this space. And then there's the classical work done by folks at NREL on this in aggregate. And then recently there's been a bunch of interesting work that looks at market design and coupling market mechanisms to this grid optimization in ways that formulate how do you express flexibility, how do you express loads that don't have defined properties of the traditional type. The traditional type is, I want this many megawatts in this hour, right? There's no way to express, well, I could take 5 to 7 megawatts in that hour, provided you gave me whatever was the residual in this other hour, right? There's no way to express that in the markets as they exist today. That kind of coupled or flexible kind of thing is a big challenge, both for what should you want to express, and then how can you actually close a market, right? Given you have those kinds of specifications, right? I think the theory doesn't exist for how to close those kinds of markets. So lots of interesting problems, lots of interesting work has gone in this space. So let me just say one more thing that I try to say to motivate computer scientists to want to do more. And I presented this at the first time at the CLEAR workshop at ISCA in 2021. And I also wrote an article about this that was published in CACM in December of the same year. And the basic idea is this is the history of how cloud computing companies have told you they're going to be sustainable. So in the beginning, they did something that was good. So Google first said that they were going to be, on an offset basis, carbon neutral. So what does that mean? That means they got some load, they consume power as shown on the left, and they signed some long-term purchase contract as shown on the right, and they said, these things don't have anything to do with each other, but they wash each other out, right? So that's an offsetting-based scheme, and that's largely discredited as not being very substantial these days, though most industry and most organizations are still trying to declare themselves carbon neutral in spaces because they haven't even achieved that, right? But that's not really true. It's not really reality, right, for what's going on in the grid. So the second thing that they've proposed, and I think Microsoft has ascribed to this as well now, and I don't remember whether Amazon ever signed up for this, but I think they did. And I would call that better. And they call this thing 24/7 matching. So here they first deal with the fact that when you do the offsetting, you can buy renewable power in Oklahoma, and you can run your data center in Massachusetts, and I can offset them. It doesn't matter whether they're even connected to the same grid. With 24/7, they said, no, now they have to be in the same grid, and I'm going to hold myself to the following standard, which is whatever power I consume, I'm going to buy enough green power at that time I'm consuming it to cover my use, right? So here, there would be an example of if they used across the board, they need to buy enough green in the local grids to make the green cover all of their brown, right? So that's, in a nutshell, 24/7 matching. They're not there yet. They could be there tomorrow. It's a question of how much are they willing to pay, but those are the targets they have for 2030, right? But really what you'd want for the power grid is what I would call best, which is flexible load. So of course, you want to run your data centers and so on to meet whatever your need is, and then flex the load up to match renewable availability. So help the power grid to absorb renewable energy, just like with this zero carbon cloud idea. And then of course, it's probably too harsh to say the data centers go to zero, right? None of us wants our social media or our Gmail or YouTube or whatever it is you love on the internet to go away. So there's probably going to have to be this flexing up, but also some kind of baseline, the green power through energy storage or through other kinds of means, and so on. But my ambition is to get the computing industry to adopt best as the goal, right? Not settle for good or better, as shown here. So let me just summarize and then wrap here. So first, yes, AI can get the power it needs, right? We have the capacity. In fact, we're building the capacity to support far more load than we currently have. But if you do it the old way, the power growth and the DC load is going to retard decarbonization. So what you really want is for the data centers to become partners in helping the grid to balance renewables and load. So growing data center loads should become flexible to limit the harm that they cause to the power grid and to maybe do some good, maybe help the grid decarbonize, maybe accelerate decarbonization. That would be a better goal for this load that we're adding, right? And why do we pick on the data centers? Well, we don't pick on the data centers, but they're the proximate cause of all the new capacity, right? So it's tradition in our infrastructures, right, in the American system, to shift the burden or the cost, right, of the incremental capacity in the infrastructure to those folks who are arriving and causing the increase to be required. So this is very much in alignment with that. And finally, there's still lots of open research problems here. So achieving synergy requires very significant research and advances. So not only do we need to understand better how to make computing flexible and how to change applications and how to do resource management in a way that makes it all possible, But we also need to achieve, radical changes and new capabilities in data center design, power grid markets, as I've talked about. And of course, ultimately, some of this stuff has to be supported by policy and regulation so that people will come on and be dealt with fairly and equally right across all of these players in the grid. So let's challenge computing to be best, not just be good, and help the world power grids decarbonize. Thank you.
Let's take a few questions.
And these are my guys that did all the work, so I get to stand up here in front of you.
I'll start with one, and then I guess we can hand this around, right? Work? Yeah. Thank you for the great talk. So one question I had is that some of the energy provider regions in the US have what we call these advanced markets. They provide ancillary or secondary opportunities to help balance the supply-demand problem. They offer incentives for the power consumers to come play in these markets. So why does it not solve some of this, at least, stranded power problem? Because the idea of the market should be, I would imagine, that depending on the power generation availability, they would price it accordingly and provide fewer incentives or more incentives to the consumers to come play in this market. So these markets have been there, but and I agree with you, I'm kind of asking in a rhetorical way, but why does this not solve the problem by large?
Good question, right? So, the economists have been at this for a while, and there's people who have financial interests in these markets to help them solve these problems. But one of the things that you have to realize is that there's still substantial uncertainty in the operation of these power grids. So first, with renewable generation, there's forecast error and estimation error, unpredictable things like clouds and wind bursts and storms. And if a weather front comes through Boston and it comes through 1 hour earlier, 1 hour later, that has a huge impact on wind generation and solar generation and so on. So there's fundamental uncertainty in generation and renewables, and there's also uncertainty in load. I was at Cal ISO there, and one day I observed, the most surprising thing. They were running around like crazy, like something had gone wrong, and it turned out something had gone wrong. It turned out that the California power grid in the southern half of the state was in crisis. There was a shortage of generation. And the reason there was a shortage of generation is somebody missed the weather forecast by 1 degree. So all these air conditioners went on and load was through the roof and so on. And at the same time, there was a fire actually that took some of the transmission offline to tell the whole story. So I think the answer is that some of these things are fundamental safeties that they build into the system, safety margin, right? Because there's variability in both supply and in load. So that's some cause of curtailment and these other kinds of things. But the other is that these other mechanisms are expensive, right? So voltage regulation, buying excess capacity and all those kinds of things, they're not free. So all of the market optimization is trying to minimize the amount of those things you have to do. So sometimes perhaps they can't be whole solutions to the problem. Yeah.
So thank you, great talk. My question is about who pays for the infrastructure. And so I hear a lot about this with renewables. And so we would all like to put solar panels on our houses or have done that. And we connect to the grid, and on good days we get money back, but we're not paying for the infrastructure. And it's in orders of magnitude worse if you want to put a wind farm in Iowa, or how does it connect to the grid? There's no mechanism to do that. So that just, I think, at the very least, it makes your work all the more important. And I'm sure you have comments. I'm sure you've thought about that as well, how that ties in with what you're working on.
In some sense, is a great question. So one of the things that's misunderstood is there's this thing called LCOE. Anyone here know what LCOE is? So levelized cost of electricity, or per unit power. And the economists say, here's how much it costs to buy this infrastructure and the lifetime of the infrastructure and its total cost of ownership. And then they say divided by the amount of electricity that it produces. And by those measures, actually, solar and wind can be cheaper than fossil fuels. But solar and wind are fundamentally different than fossil fuels because they're not reliable. So connect solar panels to your house and then disconnect yourself from the grid. You'll quickly find out you're not very happy. So what you're really paying for in the grid, most of what you're paying for, it turns out, is not energy. It's actually reliability. So this question of infrastructure is something we're just working out, and that's why I talked about the beginning of the revolution of the power grid in this, breaking it apart in these markets, because in the olden days, right, 40, 50 years ago, the same company owned the generation, that owned the transmission, that owned the retail business to sell you the electricity, and they just rolled that all up together. Now we see this disaggregation. I don't know what your power bills look like, but mine look like supply, distribution, a bunch of other fees, and so on, right? And the distribution is the network cost, right? And then there's a bunch of things that relate to reliability. So I think people are just coming to understand that the reliability cost is really the difficult part of the market. And as I increase the fraction of renewable generation, the reliability gets harder. So the problem in California is they have all this cheap generation, but the reliability cost is going up and up and up, and that's why their power is 2 times more expensive than it used to be. And if things don't go well, they could wind up with it being 4 and 8 times more expensive, because you wind up having to buy all the renewable generation, and then you buy all the fossil fuel plants anyway for reliability. And you might think, well, I never run them. Well, no, that's not how investment works. If you almost never run them, when you run them, it's going to cost you a fortune, right? Because they have to get a return, right? Or they won't exist, right? So I think this idea of reliability and grid connect cost is the difficult challenge, right? And that's why I think we need to decouple the notion of energy from reliable energy. Those are 2 different things. And we don't need to worry so much about wasting unreliable energy in many cases, but maybe we need to be really careful with reliable energy. Yeah, great question.
Hello. Thank you for your, really great talk. I had this thought, and I wanted your opinion that, so you are saying that AI workloads can be like variable, or like the growth is determined by AI workloads. But I was thinking that an A100 or an H100 that NVIDIA is creating, it costs like $100,000, upwards of that. If I am getting that, I want to use it like 100% of the time, because that is so much costly an equipment that I don't want to run it at when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down. So in my head, I'm thinking that the AI generative workload is not variable. It's like constantly growing up. It is not in sync with the sun or with the variability. So what are your opinion on that?
It's a great question. Maybe you work for a tech company. When we first proposed zero carbon cloud, and immediately I went and proposed this to my friends who are now all very senior leaders at these tech companies, and they responded with the comment you made. They said, we already paid for the whole data center, right? We want to run it as full as we can. And it's a reasonable proposition from a financial point of view. So what we did is we cleverly went back and we said, well, you built the wrong kind of data center. You engineered for 6 nines of reliability. You're not going to run it full all the time. I can de-engineer it, right, for lower reliability, because it'll have no impact on your availability, and I can drive the cost down, right? So first, it's not a simple cost comparison, right? The second thing that you can do, right, that we have a bunch of active research in this space, is it turns out that there's no such thing as a fixed data center capacity, right? So think about it. So what are the limits on data center capacity? Well, I have to bring power into the system. I've got the computing equipment, and I have to bring heat out of the system, right? So I can always overdrive the electronics to bring in slightly more power, or I can over-provision that. So I can build a data center that has a variable range of power. Then I got these A100s or H100s or B100s. I don't think anyone has those yet. BH200s or whatever they're called. Okay, and then I need to get the heat out. It turns out I can also crank up the data center and increase the heat out. Well, how do I do that? Well, it's all water cooled these days. So I can increase my flow rate, or I can decrease the coolant temperature, right? And these things increase my cooling capacity. Why don't we do that today? The answer is we're stuck on PUE, right? So people say, oh, you can't turn up the flow rate because, there's a resistance, it's nonlinear, and therefore your PUE is going to go down. But the truth is, this whole comment about efficiency, right, means that I'm only going to do this when the energy is cheap or when it's low carbon. So maybe I can do this. And then the second thing is that if I can increase that cooling capacity, right, then I can maybe also overclock my BH200s or something like that, right? And as long as I can get the heat out, then it won't burn the thing up. So the answer is yes, I understand that you care about your TCO, right? And I understand that that's a problem, but it looks like there's many other sources of ways of creating variation, right? Now, I haven't quite solved your problem because you'll just say to me, well, then why don't I just run it at maximum all the time, which is one accounting kind of view of it. But then another kind of view of it may be that you would want to run it dynamically, right? If, for example, running it at max power all the time affects things like lifetime and so on, which we know these kinds of electronic effects. So the answer is, I think you're right, that's a really important problem, but we've been working on that for the last 4 or 5 years, and there are some ways actually to skin the cat in a slightly different way to make it make sense to do that. Now, first you've got to deliver the technical goods on this, and then you have to beat your way through the accounting structures and the management and the organizational cost structures to get this actually done. We're a little ways from that, right? But it's a great question, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the
I'll try to give shorter answers, I'm sorry, yeah.
okay. Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. I had a question about the scheduling or the cooperation between the data centers and the grid operators. Now, one is more about organizational structure. Who would this information be shared with? Are you envisioning the data centers coming together, creating a pool and sharing it with the ISO on the market which they want their the information about for queuing up their processes? And the second thing is that if you have multiple data centers competing, would you not be passing on the buck by saying that you already previously said that, okay, if there are too many data centers, they would inadvertently kick off more peaker units or bi-peaker units?
Yeah.
Would this not be the same case if you have even a scheduling algorithm the day ahead, everyone is competing for the same time? So how do you account for this in a cooperative manner? So that's my question.
So the answer to the first question is, we assume that the data center companies don't want to share information with each other. Some of them are their direct competitors. So the information sharing is only vertical. They give the data to the power grid, they give it to them 24 hours in advance. They still tell us, oh, you know, we don't want to share that, that's confidential. I think that's just nonsense. The power company knows what their power use was yesterday and the 900 days before that. So really, I doubt they're giving up much information, but they're just, you know, habitually kind of secretive, right? I'm sorry, what was the second question?
The second question is that if you have multiple data centers competing.
Oh, yeah. So the answer is, the other reason why you need to supply this information vertically and not pooled is that it depends on where you're attached to the grid, right? So load over here is not equivalent to load over here because of transmission constraints. So that's why the information has to be direct and unvarnished. In terms of competition, I think that's kind of intrinsic. So if you assume that these are autonomous actors, right, that can do whatever they want that's in their self-interest, then you have to allow the possibility that there could be synchronized load. It turns out that even if there is synchronized load, given the information to the grid allows it to do a better job. So you may not get the same benefit, but you will get benefit from this scheme even in that case. Yeah, great question.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Professor, for his talk today. We mainly talk about the grid, but I'm curious when it comes to the microgrid in the data centers. It's kind of follow up to the previous question about the utility, because the grid, as you mentioned, you know, that's a macro scale that's been going on. But many data centers that I know in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, you know, they are building up their own, you know, their proprietary, you know, like solar panels. And on top of their existing UPS, they might do more backup batteries. And I'm curious how this, you know, micro level engineering would contribute to your literature or this narrative.
Yeah, it's a great question because, of course, data centers have backup power to begin with, right? They can have backup generation. And I would call out, actually, Microsoft has been particularly innovative in this area. They have several pilots where what they do is they share their backup capacity, their backup generation capacity, with the power grid. So they reduce the requirement for the power grid to add generation capacity to support their kind of load. So there's lots of room for innovation there. We are doing some research in that space, and others have done research in that space. But we wanted to start from the point of view of trying to achieve a separation of concerns, right? So we've been trying to deal with the inside data center issues separately from the outside of data center issues. So I think that's a good research area. But the problem is right now is what's the goal, right? So inside the data center, what do I want to achieve at this interface? I don't know what to optimize it for. So So we've been trying to define that goal, and so the grid interaction is to define that goal. Once you've got that goal, if you accept that goal, and the data center companies haven't yet accepted that goal, then I think you can do lots of optimization. But you need all kinds of internal information to do that optimization about workload and about objective and so on, right? I think that's really interesting. There's a lot of microgrid in the data center work now about dealing with GPU load, because GPUs have a lot of variation in the computing, the electric power load that they generate, depending on computing that they're doing. I'm also curious about, whether in the co-location data centers there's interesting problems, because in some sense, if it's all Google stuff, then Google can at the top just decide how to manage this. But if it's a co-location facility and you've got these varying loads, then it's really interesting because again, you have separate objectives, right? So I think there's lots of interesting problems in that space. Yeah.
There's one question here then.
There's all kinds of interesting consequences, right, for public policy and infrastructure that arise from this, stranded power kind of concern. When I was at Cal ISO, the public policy of California was to force apartments and homes to build charging stations, right, in order to allow people to buy electric cars. But it turns out that's exactly the wrong thing, because that encourages them to add load at night. What you want to do is encourage people to add load during the day. So they should have been telling the employers they needed to build charging stations inside of their parking lots and their employee facilities and their shopping malls and so on. So they got this wrong for at least 5 years. And then some folks at Stanford published a paper on this last year, and I think they finally righted but it was obvious to us 5 years ago, right? But there is some value in being at Stanford, they get them to listen to you, yeah.
Fabulous lecture, Andrew. Following on with what you said about cooling problems with the water cooling and PUE and so forth. So to my understanding, there's some staggering percentage of the power that's consumed by DCs that is attributable to just air conditioning and the need to keep them cool. Is there a way to use that excess heat, in effect, as a kind of an alternative power source in and of itself? And how is that being optimized and thought about?
Question. So it turns out we can quantify the amount of energy that's being used for those cooling kinds of things, because the whole idea of PUE is to compare the amount of electric power that goes into the data center to the amount of power that reaches the electronics. Never mind if it's wasted once it gets into electronics with some video game or other kinds of things. So typical PUE ratios for modern good data centers could be 1.1 or 1.2 or something like that. So we can estimate that power at it's not an insubstantial amount of power, but it's not the most of it, right? It's maybe 20% or 10% of the whole. Now, can you do something with that waste heat? Yeah, it turns out you can. And there's examples of people heating swimming pools, heating apartment buildings, and so on with waste heat. And the main problem is you need physical proximity in order to do this. So if I have a data center in the basement, I could heat this building. If I have a data center in Western Mass, it's probably not going to be viable to pipe the heat to here in order to do it. There's a lot of interest in finding innovative new modular uses that could be built on site next to these data centers that are in remote places. And one of the things that's actually good is that with liquid cooling, the coolant temperatures and the heat intensity that we're drawing out of these as opposed to air cooling is now more useful, because with heat energy, the bigger gap that you can get and the higher absolute temperature you can get, the more applications become viable. So I think there's more opportunity in that space. I'm not sure how critical it is to make use of it, but it would be a good thing to do, right? Yeah, great question.
Thank you for the lecture. I think I'm the last question, so I'll keep it very short. But I do want to hear your opinion and ask for your insight on this zero grid data center, zero carbon, which I love. I think it's a very strong concept. But have you thought about the merit order of other users of that stranded power that could be, use that electricity at that time before the data center would start to make use of that? As an analogy, a hospital might be able even to do that, but then as a very last user in a curve, where the first one would be maybe heat in a boiler or a heat pump system. So would it, when would this, yeah, so I would love to hear your response.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, if you're going to drop some load or have some load that's potentially not servable by the grid, then it does beg the question, well, what if I have two loads and do I prioritize them somehow? I would say, you know, the first thing I would say is a simple way to think about it. So I described it as a differential protocol akin to TCP, and TCP doesn't provide any ordering per se, right? So the basic idea is you get everyone to behave well, and then, you know, the folks who get in there are just kind of random or luckily chosen, right, or arbitrarily chosen. It's not defined by the protocol. So that's one answer, which is we haven't worked on that as a problem. The second question is, I think, more interesting, which is, could you design some order or design some priority and mechanism to do that? I think that's possible. You know, I think we've shied away from that because I think that immediately gets you deep into the dispatch mechanisms and deep notions of fairness that the economists, you know, are extremely protective of and are at the heart of these open markets. So the only today accepted way of dealing with that is through market mechanisms, and by that, what do I mean? I mean price, right? So it would be possible, I think, to build a pricing mechanism in to actually capture those loads, bidding in a differential and then prioritized order. But we haven't studied that. Yeah, great.
Now that it's around 4:30, I'd like to finish it, but hopefully Andrew can be here for a few more minutes if you would like to discuss offline. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for a wonderful
Thank you
lecture
very
and
much.
visiting us, Andrew.